Question. How would you feel if you were called to give up everything? Your status, your money, your job, your career, your family, everything that you have, to become a servant of God. Now that may sound rather righteous, and a lot of us would say, yeah, I'm ready to go. But let's face the facts. Not many of us are really that willing to give up anything for anybody. There's a part of our human nature is very self-centered. I'm pleased to have served this wonderful congregation for 38 years now. And I gave up some things to be the rabbi here. I gave up a lucrative career as a CPA. I gave up relationships with some of my family members. I gave up acceptance from the rabbis in Howard County and other places. And I want to tell you something. None of what I gave up holds a candle to what Paul gave up. Paul gave up a great position as an eminent scholar of his day. He was a student of the leading rabbinical teacher of that day, Rabbi Gamaliel, and Paul was the top student in his yeshiva, in his seminary. Great man. He gave it all up because God called him to service. What a life he had. He spent every minute of his day thinking about the calling on his life, the calling to be a missionary, if you will, to the Jew first, but also to the Gentile. Most of his life was spent teaching and reaching the Goyim, the nations. He wanted to do nothing but present the good news as far as he could. That's what his life's calling was. That's what his life's work was all about. I think that every day when he woke up, he thought, what can I do today to spread the gospel? And I imagine he had a lot of dreams during the night about that very issue. Paul was a passionate man, and he was as zealous as they come. Remember, he was an anti-Messianic Jew. He wasn't a Messianic Jew at first. He was against the Messianic Jews of the first century. He was a nasty guy. He persecuted many of the Messianic Jews in the first century, even agreeing with some that they would be killed. But since his call to spread the Messiah's message to the Jew first, also the Gentile, remember, he gave up everything to do this. He gave up everything. To me, like Moses, that's what humility is all about. When we're willing to give up our rights, when we're willing to sacrifice ourselves, that is what humility is all about. Moses was like that. Moses gave up everything to serve his people in the wilderness. And you know that was not a pleasant job. Well, last week we learned how the gospel could spread in many different ways. Remember, Paul was sentenced to prison and potential execution for preaching the gospel, specifically saying that the Emperor Nero, the Emperor of Rome, was not the one who should be worshipped. God should be worshipped. Paul was willing to do that because he was a passionate man for the truth, and he risked his life. That's why he was in prison. He wasn't going to get away from that kind of message, kind of teaching for too long in the Roman world, because Nero was not happy about somebody else being the head dude, right? Nero wanted to be the head dude, Emperor Nero. Yet Paul was saying there's somebody else who takes precedence, God and his Messiah. So he wasn't going to get away with that too long. He ended up being arrested, and he spent the final 2 years of his life under house arrest, but he was on his way to execution. But in that chains, as he said, in his chains, good things happened. People heard about Paul being in prison, Paul being taken out of his life of freedom and sent to prison. And yet in all that, he continued to be faithful to God. And that was what caused people to hear his message. They saw his life. They saw him being faithful. So the gospel was preached through Paul's imprisonment, and now he needs to explain that there's another way to spread the good news, and here's what it is. You'll be surprised. Jealousy. The gospel got spread through Paul's imprisonment, and Paul's saying the gospel is also spread through jealousy. I'm reading from Phillipians chapter 1, starting at verse 15. He says this, "True, some are proclaiming the Messiah out of jealousy and rivalry, but others are doing it in goodwill." This is first Philippians chapter 1, verse 15. "The latter act from love, aware that I am put where I am for defending the good news, while the former announce the Messiah out of selfish ambition with impure motives, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me in prison." He recognized that some people were preaching the gospel for righteous reasons, and some were doing it for the wrong reasons. His response in verse 18, "But so what?" Can you imagine? But so what? All he cared about was the spread of the good news. He didn't care how it happened or who did it. He wanted to see the gospel spread. But so what? All that matters is that in every way, whether honestly or in pretense, the Messiah is being proclaimed, and in that I rejoice, yes, and I will continue to rejoice. One of the key themes of the letter to the Philippians is the word I talked about when I introduced this letter, humility. Humility, which is what Rabbi Foreman talked about this morning, humility. Like Moses, a great man, Paul was humble, meaning he submitted to whatever God called him to do and be, and he just mentions this. He contrasted with people who share the good news for personal gain, for self-ambition, for fame. Paul here is not criticizing their message, but rather their spirit of self-ambition. Paul elaborates in verse 18, where he commends that the word of Yeshua is spreading even if done by unworthy messengers. Some of the proclaimers of the good news were preaching out of impure motives. I know that some television preachers don't always have the most spiritual lives. I think of people, and if these are your favorite TV preachers, I'm sorry, but I think of people who have fallen from high places like Jimmy Swaggart, Benny Hinn, and even some rabbis today who are falling because of some of the bad behavior and practices they've had. Yet the word does go forth. People with power and influence are subjected to all sorts of ways to fall: greed, sex, sexual immorality, and any weakness, of course, that the evil one finds and exploits to create havoc. Why? Why does the evil one go after the people who have the most power and importance? Because they have important and big platforms. They're the ones who people see on television. Well, who do you think the evil one's going to go after? Some minor character who's got not influence at all? No, the evil one's going to go after the ones who have the biggest platform, the biggest people, and that's why people like Joel Osteen, I don't know what you think of him, it doesn't matter, but he's reaching a lot of people. We have to pray for people like that, because the evil one's going to go after anybody who has influence, because they have more impact than the little guy. You know the expression, the bigger they are, the harder they fall? What's true in the spiritual world as well. Many of these people fall into sin and then fail Yeshua. Here Paul is saying that even though that's not good, the good news is still getting out, and that's what ultimately counts. Paul's passion enabled him to see what's really important. He didn't care about their private behavior so much. All he wanted to see was God's good news spread far and wide. Now don't get the wrong idea. Paul encouraged people to live righteously. In fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, he gives some instructions to his disciple Timothy on how to appoint people to be in charge of congregations. So he says things like this. Here's a statement you can trust. Anyone aspiring to be a congregational leader, that's a rabbi, an elder, somebody in leadership, is seeking a worthwhile work. It's okay to want to be a congregational leader, a rabbi or an elder in a congregation. But he says a congregational leader must be above reproach. He must be faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, orderly, hospitable, and able to teach, and so forth and so on. There's a lot of pressure on being a congregational leader, and Paul's saying here, I want the gospel presented, but I want people who present it to grow and become more spiritually oriented. Even though Paul supports the spread of the good news any way possible, he does encourage good behavior among the leaders that hopefully will trickle down to the congregation itself. I must confess, I guess this is going out on the internet, right?
Facebook. Yeah.
Live streaming or whatever. I have no idea why God placed me as the leader of Emmanuel 38 years ago. I have no idea. I was not trained to be a rabbi. I was trained to be a missionary. And I served about 10 years doing missionary work among Jewish people. So I was when I first took over at Emmanuel, I wasn't really fit to be a rabbi. In addition to that, I did not have the ideal Jewish background. I am 100% Jewish. I have 4 Jewish grandparents. I love being Jewish, but I was more a cultural Jew, or as I like to say, a gastronomic Jew. You know what a gastronomic Jew is? Corned beef sandwiches, lox and bagels. That's a gastronomic Jew. That was how I was raised. There was no religion in my Jewish home. It was all about culture. Jewish music, Jewish movies, lox and bagels. Well, I guess lox and bagels have spread. They're not just Jewish anymore, are they? Everybody knows what bagels are. They sell them at McDonald's, so you know that bagels have lost their Jewish ethos. But even though I didn't have the greatest Jewish background, for some reason God felt that I could serve this congregation. Fortunately, I've had a chance to learn a lot more since I took over this congregation a long time ago, 38 years ago. And there are many people that I've met along the way in this congregation that are way more spiritual than I am. There are people who I have served with that are more godly, who read the Bible way more than I do, that pray more than I do, that study more than I do. And yet, why did God choose me to lead the congregation? I think it has something to do with my willingness to serve. I think God sometimes is more interested in our willingness than our ability. You know, it says people need to be ready, willing, and able. I wasn't that ready. I wasn't that able, but I was willing. So God said, okay, Reuben, you. So in 1981, Emmanuel chose me to be its leader. Never have quite figured that out. But there have been some people over the years who've resented that a lot. There are people who have better training than I do, better skills than I do, and yet I was the one chosen, and I've been the one to maintain this position for 38 years. A lot of people have, not a lot of people, but some people have resented this. They have been, to use Paul's word, jealous. They have been jealous. One fellow, I'm not going to mention any names, but some of you know him, wonderful brother, wonderful brother. He never went anywhere without a commentary to read about the Bible. When I would meet him for coffee somewhere or lunch, he would always have a book he was studying. Dedicated to the Lord, dedicated to studying. Except he had no pastoral skills. He had no pastoral gift. So he never was appointed rabbi of this congregation, although he wanted to be in ministry desperately. I said to him, you know, what you should do is be a Bible school teacher, because you really have skills and you know what you're talking about. Get a job as a Bible school teacher and teach them what you know, because I don't think you have pastoral skills. Well, he did not become a Bible school teacher, but in his jealousy toward me, he left Emmanuel and he started going to a church, which is fine. And he taught people in that church an awful lot about the Jewish background of the faith. He taught those people about the Jewish Messiah. He taught them about the Bible through Jewish eyes, which is the only way to really read the Bible. He had a great ministry in this church, but it was his jealousy toward me that caused that to happen. You see, God uses anything to proclaim the good news, and this brother was used by God in this particular church that he went to. So even though that jealousy hurt my relationship with him to some extent, and hurt our congregation to lose a good brother here, the message of God was spread further than it otherwise would have been. God used jealousy to help spread his message. Just as he used Paul's chains, he used jealousy in this case. So the gospel can be spread by someone in prison and also by somebody who is jealous. The bottom line, listen to this. The bottom line, friends, is that the Lord can use imperfect people and imperfect circumstances to accomplish his perfect will.
Amen.
I have a good friend in this congregation. His name is Steve Goodwich. Right there. A long time, several years ago, I said, Steve, you know, you ought to step up and be our cantor. You have a very good voice. You have an authentic Jewish background, so you know how the melodies sound. And you're a spiritual man. He said, I'm not the cantor. But don't you think he's doing a great job? Yeah. And he doesn't like being called Cantor Steve, because he knows he's not a trained cantor. But he's doing what cantors do, leads us in worship with his chanting. So thank you, Steve. God uses imperfect people and imperfect skills to do a perfect work. And I'm glad you stepped into the breach. So Paul is trying to get through to the Philippians that one way or another, the word has to get out. Either it's whether he's in chains or through jealousy or something, some other way. The fact is, no preacher that I know of, even the greatest preachers, is perfect. No human being is perfect. So you can assume that even the greatest television preacher has clay feet. Everybody has got ways they can fail and fall. And we have to pray for those who have leadership. And I hope you will pray for me, because I could fall too. And I pray that doesn't happen. Somehow for 38 years, God has sustained me. Well, Paul knew that people were coming to know God and becoming followers of Yeshua through the word of truth. David Stern puts it this way in one of his books: it is the gospel that saves people, not the preacher. The insincere evangelist is storing up for himself judgment, but those who have come to Yeshua because of his words have entered eternal life. It's good for us to remember that even though we may mess up, and Steve, you're entitled to mess up from time to time, and less, God can and will use us for his glory to proclaim the good news to both Jews and Gentiles. God is not looking for perfect people. He's looking for submitted servants. Let me say that again. God is not looking for perfect people. He's looking for submitted servants. Moses was not perfect. He was a submitted servant, though. Now, you may not be the best singer, but God is pleased that you might be willing to sing. Thankfully, we have some musicians, Michael, Konaniah, Gloria and a couple other people who are stepping up to learn to sing together in a group. Thank God they can carry a tune. But God's looking for the heart. I think he likes hearing music in tune. Don't we all? But he's really looking for the perfect heart, the submitted heart. Some of us come up and read from the Torah, and we stumble over some of the Hebrew words. God bless you all for trying to read the Hebrew words. You're standing up here, I can see it in your face, you go, oh my God, I know this Hebrew word is impossible for me to speak, even though it's in English letters, and you give it a shot. God's looking not for perfect Hebrew readers, but submitted servants. But keep at it. You get better and better and better. Paul continues, for I know that this will work out for my deliverance because of your prayers and the support I got from the Spirit of Yeshua the Messiah. That's verse 16. So we can say in verse 20, in all accords with my earnest expectation and hope that I will have nothing to be ashamed of, but rather now, as always, the Messiah will be honored by my body, whether it's alive or dead. This is a very interesting point, he says. He says, I want Messiah to be honored whether I'm alive or dead. Remember, Paul wrote the letter to the Phillipians from prison, where he was on his way to execution by Nero. And yet he just hopes that the gospel will be preached no matter whether he's alive or dead. And he calls this a dilemma in chapter 1, verse 21. Do I live or do I die? For me to live is the Messiah, he said, and death is gain. It's a very heavy statement. For me, life is the Messiah and death is gain. What does he mean? It's one of the more familiar verses in Philippians. Here we can see that what he's saying is that he knows when he dies, he'll be with the Messiah. And that's all he wanted in his life, was to be with Yeshua, to serve him and be close to him. Yet he realizes that if he stays alive, he can help more people. So he wrestles with this. We read this in Galatians as well, the same struggle he had. Yet he concluded, as long as God has a job for him to do, he wanted to stay alive. And that's how we should all be. Paul wrote in Galatians, same thing, when the Messiah was executed on the stake as a criminal, I was too, so that my proud ego no longer lives. Isn't that something? Here Paul admits he has a terribly proud ego. Why? He was top in his school, top dog, great rabbinical scholar of that day. He had a big ego, and he said, when the Messiah died as a criminal on the stake, I died too, and my ego died as well. But the Messiah lives in me, and the life I now live in my body, I live by the same trusting faithfulness that the Son of God had, who loved me and gave himself up for me. That's in Galatians 2:20. So Paul's life was living for the Messiah and sharing the life-changing good news with everybody he could find. Now, given the possibility, or more appropriately, the probability of execution awaiting him after his appearance before Nero, Paul reflects on what this death may mean. Again, living for him is joy. Living for Yeshua is joy and passion. But if he dies, he says he'll even gain more. Where is his heart? He's a sold-out servant of the Lord. Talk about humility. Paul had finally become humbled. Do we feel like this? Do all we want to do is serve the King? We may say that, but do we behave like that? We each have to ask ourselves, is our heart all about serving God or not? I imagine it's not 100%, but guess what? You're here today. You're here today because you want to grow toward that end. So God sees that, and God will honor that. So Paul resolved his dilemma by choosing to live. But he wanted his Philippian friends to know this very essential lesson so they could emulate him. to skip down to verse 27, the end of this chapter, and then I'll pick up chapter 2 next week. After he wrestles with this, he turns to his Philippian friends and says, here's what I want for you. I want you to walk worthy lives. Verse 27, only conduct your lives in a worthy way of the good news of Messiah, so that whether I come and see you or hear about you from a distance, you stand firm, united in spirit, fighting with one accord for the faith of the good news. His challenge to this congregation is that they're united in spirit. They're unified. They have unity among them, and that they're fighting for the good news, the faith in the good news, to proclaim it. He wanted to see them have unity. And the word here that he says, conduct your lives, is a Greek word that's only used in one other place in the Bible, in Acts 23:1, where it's a reference to one's conduct dedicated to the Lord. Interesting enough, Josephus, the Jewish historian, used the same Greek word when he said that Josephus, by the way, was not a religious Jew. He was a historian most of his life. He wrote the great works of history of the Jewish people. Everybody knows about them. But he said this, when he described what happened in his life, when he turned back to come back to Judaism, he used the same Greek word, that his conduct would reflect the teachings of the Torah. So Josephus wrote, so when I had accomplished my desires, I returned back to the city, being now 19 years old, and I began to conduct myself according to the rules of the sect of the Pharisees, which is of akin to the sect of the Stoics, as the Greeks call them. So just as Josephus chose to conduct his life in accordance with halacha, the halachic way, the following the Torah, Paul is here calling the Philippians to conduct their new lives as followers of Yeshua, walking in the example of the Messiah. Not frightened by any opposition. Verse 29, this will be for them an indication that they are headed for destruction and deliverance. And this is from God. He says to have no fear, because for the Messiah's sake it has been granted to you not only to trust in him, but also to suffer for him. Wait a minute. You've been granted to trust in him and then also to suffer for him? I'm sorry, folks. That doesn't sound that wonderful to me. Who's thrilled that they've been chosen to suffer? Who wakes up every morning and thinks, thank God today I can suffer? I don't think any of us do if we're sane. But Paul's trying to get through to the Philippians that even though they may not want to suffer, everybody has been chosen to suffer. In fact, he refers to something, the concept in Acts chapter 5, verse 41, where Luke writes, the emissaries left the Sanhedrin at having been considered worthy of suffering disgrace on account of him. Same concept. The apostles, the messenger of God, messengers of God went and talked to the Sanhedrin, the court, and they were considered heretics. And they celebrated, they considered that suffering a disgrace on account of the Messiah to be something wonderful to be proud about, feel good about. They were worthy. In verse 30, the closing of this, he says, to fight the same battles you once saw me fight, and now hear that I am still fighting. As one who has faced much persecution, Paul now calls the Philippians to follow his example, a road of suffering. As Paul has faced opposition in his faith in Yeshua and his proclamation of the good news, he calls the believers in Philippi to stand firm and emulate his willingness to suffer for the faith. You know what? Friends, we have it easy, don't we? We really do have it easy. Compared to believers around the world, we have it easy. Look at this lovely building we worship It's mostly air conditioning, although I think the air conditioning might have stopped. Getting warm in here, I think. It's air conditioned, it's fairly bright. Chairs are comfortable, reasonably comfortable. There are believers around the world who, when they worship, have nothing but problems. They don't even have lights, electricity, heat, air conditioning, nothing. But they gather for fellowship. We have it easy, and we hope that we do continue to have it easy. We live in a Judeo-Christian world. The United States of America is a Judeo-Christian mentality here. We're not afraid of proclaiming the good news, are we? Odds are, today, nobody would cut off our heads for proclaiming the good news. But that doesn't happen all over the world. In some places, it's very dangerous to be a follower of God, a follower of Yeshua. I'm afraid to tell you, we have it very easy. We have it very easy, yet we have a calling on our lives, and that calling might be a little more difficult. As a Messianic Jewish congregation, we have two purposes. One, to reach Jewish people with the good news, and secondly, teach our Gentile brothers and sisters about the Jewish background of the faith. I think the second part of it is getting easier, even though there are groups of Christians called replacement theology Christians who don't believe that the Jews are the chosen people anymore. They're difficult to deal with. But even more difficult is talking to our own people. Talking to Jewish people about the Messiah is not an easy task. I would love to see hundreds of Jewish people who don't know Yeshua show up every morning on Shabbat. Wouldn't you like that? Yes. Wouldn't that be wonderful to see the people who Jesus came to first and died for come to our services and share with us? Would that be great? Yes. I think that's possible. I can see that. But it's going to take some suffering on our part. So after Oneg, post-Oneg this morning, at 1 o'clock, we're going to have a discussion about how to reach Jewish people. Because that is our calling. That is our primary purpose. We're a unique congregation. Nobody else has any concern about reaching the Jewish people of Howard County or Baltimore or D.C. or this whole area. Especially here. So I think that's our calling, and I think we have to be willing to suffer like Paul did, but we need to keep our people on our hearts. We need to be, like Paul, waking up, thinking about how to reach our people with the Messiah's message. For that's God's goal for this congregation. So after Oneg, let's join together at 1 o'clock and talk about this and pray a little bit about this and see where we come. But keep in mind, Philippians is all about faith and humility, because it's humility that wins the day. Amen. Thank you. Please stand for Elenu as we close our service.